spiritual surrender. Spiritual surrender is not done out of place of despair only. In fact, it requires a plumb, strength, and a degree of that passion and flame, because otherwise that surrender itself is more as a capitulation, and that capitulation deprives us of the most precious asset, which is, yes, some of you, I trust, know already, that of our own unique will to power, which is the mover and shaker when it comes to why we're here in the first place. And if we are the embodiment of awareness, then that's where everything gets before it gets diversified. Because the will, knowledge, and action is the trinity with which everything is being created. These are the very, very agencies. These are the very, very powers, the very Shaktis that are at the substratum of all processes: will, knowledge, action. Very excited, I have to say. Maybe just even ever so slightly nervous. Not nervous because it's a stage fright, but nervous to the ability of being able to convey this, what we have gathered for today, because the nature of what I'm eager to relate and what we have gathered together, eager to partake in, is so extraordinary in every aspect that it almost feels as if all channels of communication need to be engaged and opened and clear, so as to not to end up with any preconceived ideas, with ready-made answers, but rather touching some of the most profound, perhaps, aspects of what it is actually means to be alive. Because this program that we have dubbed as FLOW, as an acronym for waves of, flow as the finest level of wakefulness, is not so much about how do I get what I want, when will I get what I want, do I get what I want, and so on, as very often the inquiries out there seems to be emphasizing and re-emphasizing, but rather pointing to the essence of where the wanting itself comes from, how that wanting correlates to why we all are here driven by these wantings and aspirations, whether this can be discarded or not, and if not, is there any use in incorporating that what wants something and turning this into the fuel to the highest purpose of what we call this embodiment. So this is why we decided, after some hesitations over the maybe years, certainly over many months, to come up with our own rendering of our own take on the topic. And there's no need to be coy about it. It's a topic that is trending out there quite strongly. The likes of Eckhart Tolle already delivered his second course, which was launched just last year, all about manifesting. And it seems to us, and I don't want to repeat myself already what I have mentioned in some podcasts, interviews, and conversations, which all of you are welcome to tap into when you have a moment. We put it all out freely on our YouTube channel. But it seems to me that there is this correlation between where we are collectively and why this particular theme now becomes a dominant one. But today, I welcome you to simply get this taste, this flavor of what this whole program that we are launching now in just a matter of days is all about. Because I don't want to beat about the bush or somehow pretend that we are here to answer this pertinent question in the course of this conversation or in the course of this delivery, and then propped up with some very interesting, fascinating questions that submitted in advance. I've got them printed here. But it is here to funnel all of your interests into potentially exploring this program for yourself. Because this program, I believe, is nothing short of giving the visceral, tangible possibility for not only structuring your spiritual sadhana, which at its very, very core is what this is about, but it has this unapologetic aspect which deals with the coveted theme of what it means to be a human being, even if when driven by the highest aspirations and when we accept the fact that being a human pertains to carry a load of desires that creates, in a way, a trajectory of how our lives unfolds. So this is where we will place our attention. I also welcome you to be attentive in some of the examples that I would bring during today's time together, which seemingly may sound as if we have covered this, but I would like you to still nevertheless ponder on this with freshness it deserves. And I would make my best to point out what exactly I want your attention to be on, particularly when we will be responding to some of the questions, and also with regard to this, let's say, analogies, metaphors that are given. Because we all agree that the nature of the spiritual discourse is a utilization of appropriately fitting metaphor, and the metaphor itself is what allows for the insight to be gained without trying to put all the dots on I, without trying to pin it down. Because let's face it, spiritual realization, the highest insight, all kinds of satoris, all kinds of whatever we may call it as recognitions, are not because something is being pinned down and being firmly under our thumb, but by virtue of the paradox of life, that quicksilver-like nature of consciousness, which is malleable at all times, is what makes it so exhilarating, devastating, extraordinary, unpredictable, and at the very same time, thrilling and loving all at once. So I will work with the metaphor of an actor and acting, because I would like to revisit that again today, with perhaps some freshly taken insights to gain from. And I would like to also speak to something that often is being brought in the spiritual discourse with regard to this let's say, again, paradoxical aspect of being at once, being and becoming, where that double slit experiment, let's say, analogy of wave versus particle is the greatest of all the paradoxes, where that what exhibits itself purely as undiluted, uninhibited energy, pure pulsation, that bioplasma of cosmic movement, and at the very same time appears as something so particular, at times as dense as the granite or even carbon, and everything in between, as light as the feather dislodged from a flying bird. So all these, and in addition, those of you who have taken the Kundalini course and have been also perhaps privy to the conversation of the emphasis on that particular aspect with regard to the particular place that Kundalini plays in that phase of its scintillation, when that propensity for remaining, as it were, in the state of unmanifest, when it is always ready to merge back with its source. And at the very same time, how a slightest movement of any excitation, so to speak, that arises within awareness at that infinitesimally, indescribably subtle state begins an unstoppable process of manifestation, which cascades down through this extraordinary way of how all is taking form through thatness of creation, exemplified by categories, the so-called in Sanskrit tattvas of creation. So this will also be very important for some of you, certainly might be on the level of personal realization and revelation, that scintillating aspect where literally it becomes the builder and shaker, the mover and shaker of it all. Because that aspect is not only spoken with regard to the metaphysical picture of manifestation, let's say, if we are to take a course here on manifestation from a point of view of particular system, let's say, of Indian philosophy. No, the whole point is that that aspect is present absolutely at every single moment when there is some kind of propensity for action rises. This is where I wanted to bring your attention again to the importance of that, because, as I said, it will become very clear, because some of these questions that you have submitted in advance, there is this red thread runs through, which is very, very interesting, in a way how several questions almost linked together by the same inquiry, just worded differently, just put across differently. So, manifesting, desires, intents. What are the mechanics? What is the propensity there in the first place? So let me perhaps say it in that more of a categorical manner of unfoldment applying the highest understanding. It's not about what I or you want. It's not about what we want in life. It's always about who I am. In other words, irrespective to what is the motivational force, it doesn't matter. Someone here is the most seasoned seeker, a sliver away from the highest degree of realization, and someone who doesn't give a hoot about all the spiritual matters. I don't know, a politician, a gangster, a criminal, or someone who works as a social worker. All this is always boils down to that what is always at play, and that is, who am I? So in other words, behind the scenes, this is what is already at play. This is what is always at play. In other words, this is suggested here at the get-going as an opening. In order to understand the nature of desire and what we want from life, and just as a perhaps expanded footnote here or side note, it seems that it's easy to know what we want, but it's only a superficial picture. The reality of the situation is much more complex, much more intricately interwoven with the way we have even taken this shape, the way we came into this world in a particular form, what casts out a life in a certain way. So really, knowing what we want is not granted, but we all feel that somehow there is this inherent propensity that moves us throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the month, throughout the year, and in no time, we already find ourselves that life lives through us, or we live this life. And what are the motivational forces there? Where is the propensity to make this decision as opposed to another decision is not necessarily is obvious and not necessarily clearly seen. So this is why the insight into the nature of desire itself is a must before we even begin to set any intentions to what we want to manifest in our life, because something already has a very strong propensity, something already expressing itself. And I'm not even talking about here the universal state of affairs. I'm just speaking about the state of individual affairs of each and every one of us. So it's not like we're now departing into the transcendental realm where nothing is wanted from us, everything suffices for what it is. No, at the level of this embodied experience, there is one healthy acknowledgement is that we are one swelled being with desires and intentions that some of us have whatever degree of insight, whilst for many it remains to be a mystery or simply not knowing, what do I actually want from life? Do I even want anything? Well, in the meantime, if I don't want anything substantial, anything elevated enough to keep me going, let me just want something what I need on a daily basis. And so it goes. All that is fine. But the issue here is in not knowing exactly what is it that we want and what already plays itself out from behind the scenes. Therefore, I wanted to suggest this as that, let's say, a prequel that something which opens up this whole conversation is that whatever we want, whatever we desire, is in itself a response, a hidden inquiry to that what I am. And it is translated then, or rather mistranslated, misinterpreted into what I want. Because it feels at whatever level of reality, at whatever level of experience, that what I am and an object of my desire are not one and the same thing. And running ahead of time, we could conclude, even if at the speculative level, that when that is settled, when that clarity dawns, that there is no whatsoever separation between what I am and what I desire. In other words, what lays in the objective sphere of my experiences, one way or another, whether this is an object to hold in my hand, object to possess, whether this is relationship, whether it's something to own intellectually, physically, whether this is an idea to belong to, all this belongs to the objective sphere of experience. And when that is realized, that objective sphere of experience is nothing other than a perfect reflection of my own very self. At that moment, and again, it may sound categorical, but as I said, even if at a speculative level, at that moment, and not a moment sooner, we know exactly what we want. And then a paradoxical thing happens there and then. So let's make this a place for a pause before we continue, because I would like to make this very clear that without the insight that comes from the finest level of the formation of mental, let's say, frequencies, thoughts, we cannot truly know what is it that we truly want to bring forth into manifestation from that level, if there is a possibility to manifest anything in the first place. Because there is also a split of opinions with regard to what goes behind the scenes when it comes to manifesting. There are perspectives, proponents, that one can manifest absolutely everything. That because one is a conscious being, one is consciousness, full stop, not just a conscious being, one is consciousness. And since there is no limitation for consciousness, one can bring to manifestation absolutely everything. Yes, there is this perspective. I'm not a proponent of that perspective for reasons that would need to be discussed further. But I acknowledge that it exists out there in a discourse. As a total opposite to that, there is also perspective that nothing is out there that we can manifest for ourselves, because the very premise upon which the process of manifestation or the manifesting is faulty, based on the understanding that there is no separate self that desires anything. And since it all belongs to awareness and nothing else, then all these are just mental modifications. And one simply lives under the notions, again, formed by these very mental modifications, that one in fact wants something. So this is a radically different perspective. But in fact, one's life is already utterly and entirely predetermined. Which perspective is true, obviously, is beside the point. The question may rise, is there some middle ground? Is there an overlapping ground between these radically different perspectives? That one is literally God to create everything out of thin air, or one is also God, and because of that, awareness, consciousness. There is no need to manifest anything because it proceeds and subject to its own very, very way of being. And therefore, one doesn't move a pinky, everything happens on its own accord. All this is, frankly speaking, is of very little use when it comes to the real deal of spiritual work. And this is why we thought that the program that we have tried and tested, and I had to lay the cards on the table. This program was a kind of experiment, an intentional experiment, carried out in the setting of a live immersion in Mexico. And we have done our best to make it as accessible through the filmed format as it is physically possible, so as to convey that what has taken place there, to turn it then into the possibility of how it will then take shape and be perceived in an online format as this program that we're announcing now. So the main incentive behind that program was to marry almost impossible worlds, to bring together the monistic perspective with which Kashmir Shaivism operates, the monistic perspective on manifestation per se, to begin with, the process of manifestation, that whole cascading of the categories, which is the body of Shiva, as we say it. In other words, awareness concealed in the world of forms and phenomena. Awareness takes form, and this universe is the form of Shiva, form of awareness. And one cannot tear apart, you cannot dislodge the form from its essence, no matter how much you try. This is the beauty of the monistic system. This is the beauty of this monistic philosophy, that if it was an appearance, then it would be only subject to mental modifications, whatever, imagining things. But the perspective here is very different. The perspective, it's physical idealism. This monistic philosophy could be spoken of as physical idealism, because the physicality of the universe is not denied, it's not diminished, it's not meant to be overseen, but in fact, that's where the greatest, as it were, secret, the greatest mystery in that incomprehensible relationship of how awareness conceals itself through and in the forms and phenomena. And we all already at a given partake in that manifestation by virtue of being that awareness in a concealed form as so and so. So we're taking that loftiest philosophy, beautiful philosophy of Trika Shaivism, and then we bring something almost as an antidote to that from the dualistic perspective, something from the Patanjali Sutras, which rests firmly on the Samkhya philosophy, and zoom into the third chapter, which deals with extraordinary powers, the chapter which deals with the development of extraordinary abilities. And the purpose of development of extraordinary abilities here is not for some frivolous display of these abilities, but because it is understood that for the one who set on that path of particular unique form of yoga that Patanjali belongs to, Patanjali Yoga is a unique form of yoga. The resonance of that yoga is what gives us yoga as we know it today in its 8-limb form, as that Ashtanga, 8-limb form, not to be confused with gymnastics on the yoga mat. And in doing so, gives that yogi an access with that tool as, let's say, on a subtle level, most precise surgical tool one can have, or like that laser beam of light, to zoom into particular aspects of one's psyche so as to at once culture it and derive the greatest benefit for the purpose and for the goal of utmost and ultimate realization that is expounded in the philosophy culminating in the 4th chapter. But the 3rd chapter deals with these unique approaches. And this is what we did. We zoomed there, we selected 14 sutras from the Vibhuti Pada, dedicated specifically to the development of the extraordinary powers, so as to implement, weave it into our program for the benefit of everyone, so that one can have access to that level when one can have literally a familiarity with the way thought itself forms, how it colors our perception, how it colors in turn our, let's say, outlook on everything, and how we then go about life in a broad daylight in terms of the affairs of this world, so that we don't basically bump around and create havoc out of our life simply because largely ridden or driven by unconscious or even subconscious material, which constantly produced, constantly harvested by ourselves, because that's the way our psyche is made. Because the form that we embody, down to the way the DNA took this particular shape as each and every one of us, is following with precision of how this particular body is equipped for this particular embodiment as an attempt at, well, we could say, as an attempt to either enjoy the fruits of our actions, or if someone protests like, well, my life is far from just enjoyment, then we could say simply by reaping the fruits of actions. So even the body as we know it, each of our bodies subject to the constitutional setup determined already at the moment our body is formed in a womb, and then subject to the further development that is shaped by the environment during the formative years. All this is a result of being molded by these very, very propensities that we inherited one way or another. And we inherited them from nowhere, but that what at some point laid sediment at a very subtle level as these mental projections and impressions. Those of you studying yoga know exactly what I'm talking about, because in Vedic yogic tantric vocabulary, all these are known as vasanas, samskaras, and vikalpas. that all together create that so-called wheel of samsara that keeps rotating on its own. So this is what, in a nutshell, or the outlook of the program itself. And the uniqueness, of course, of this is in the attempt, which we will be judged by the peers in the field, scholars, everyone is welcome, to bring this very tool at its face value, incompatible systems, into one program. And the reason why it has been done is precisely what I have just tried to outline, is so as to give access from where at once we could know where desire and why desire springs in a certain form, in a certain way, and to make our desires and intentions as conscious as we possibly could. So that we are no longer driven by unconscious and subconscious material that we think is being from the department of the conscious, because it presents itself. And one would argue, well, why to complicate matters? Isn't it normal for every human being to want to have a loving relationship, a nice house, living in a country where there's no war, living in, let's say, and then we can start deciding where do we draw the line, and we will very soon find out that it will be very difficult to draw the line of what would be considered to be an acceptable norm, right? So we will agree at some fundamental level that yes, we all want goodness. And some of us very often end up in the situations in life where wickedness is what we get, whilst the goodness is what we have requested. So where's the cross wiring? What happened along the way? All this is hidden from the behind the scenes, precisely in the mechanics and in the anatomy of how we are the expression of the desire in the first place. So from that point of view, we are already living as a manifestation of what we've desired. Each and every one of us already masters to such degree that we have mastered this life. Stay with me, please, for a moment. Each and every one of us already living life that we have projected somehow, knowingly or unknowingly, and already it's happening. Another matter, of course, whether we are happy and satisfied with that, but it is a successful undertaking. It's a successful undertaking if you ask me. Someone is a woman, someone is a man, someone is this, someone is that, doctor, painter, spiritual teacher, I don't know, nature lover, loves doing nothing, I don't know. Gangsters, anyone amongst us? Criminals? Underground or wars in law? I mean, nothing wrong with that. It's all how we manifested ourselves, you see? So let's not just kind of like shy away from the reality of the situation. Okay, folks, I think this shall suffice to serve us as that introduction into what really, really here is the primal incentive. So the flow is an extraordinary insight into the very essence of where desire is formed, coalesced with then everything else that is bursting forth in terms of the propensity for taking our impulses out of which our life is made. And then, of course, we would know exactly how we can go about it once we have that access, that middle point, that laser point like access, because it, by virtue of how all this is woven together, it flares and presents us with the insights which are not accessible to the mental field when we just want to think about it or think things through or contemplate on this. It has to have that access to the level where all this, at the level of the templates, at the level of these categories, before the greater divergence takes place, the greater diversity, and when everything is then delta out, spreads out, diversified, and diversified in more and more ways, where we cannot know what is a driving force of why our life taking direction in such way that at some point it's like, yes, I need to settle on something. I need to land on something. I need to land on some understanding. Or some of us simply get tired and the perspectives like, okay, we'll just accept everything as it is, which is of course poor man's supper, because the acceptance here is not a true acceptance, and it's not even a true surrender. We're not talking here about we don't want to mix apples and pears here by indiscriminately viewing that what comes out of sheer tiredness and running out of our resources, psychic resources above all else, and the true manner of spiritual surrender. Spiritual surrender is not done out of place of despair only. In fact, it requires a plumb, strength, and a degree of that passion and flame, because otherwise, that surrender itself is more as a capitulation. And that capitulation deprives us of the most precious asset, which is, yes, some of you, I trust, know already, that of our own unique will to power, which is the mover and shaker when it comes to why we're here in the first place. And if we are the embodiment of awareness, then that's where everything gets before it gets diversified. Because the will, knowledge, and action is the trinity with which everything is being created. These are the very, very agencies. These are the very, very powers, the very Shaktis that are at the substratum of all processes: will, knowledge, action.